It's hard to say anything good about COVID-19. We all wish the pandemic had never struck the United States or anywhere else in the rest of the world either. But there can be some positive results as we work our way toward a post-COVID-19 world. Among the positives, new thinking about government regulation. Well, our next guest has some interesting thoughts on that topic. Ryan Young is Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Welcome to HeadLocke.
Thank you for having me, Mitch.
This has been something that people have talked about a bit during this time of pandemic, and that is we need to sort of streamline some of these regulations to deal with the healthcare issues. Maybe it's time to rethink whether we needed these regulations at all.
That's right. If a regulation is causing harm during a pandemic, odds are it was causing harm to begin with. So we at the Competitive Enterprise Institute like to call these regulations never needed, because they were probably never needed anyway. We have a basic principle that we work on, is that if a regulation gets between, say, sick people and healthcare, it's probably a bad regulation. If it gets between hungry people and food, or between willing workers and an opportunity for a job, those are probably also bad regulations, and we should get rid of them.
You mentioned never needed. In this age of social media, this has even become a hashtag never needed. And I've seen this crop up anytime we've seen something about a regulation that people are starting to question. That has to be a good sign as someone who looks at regulations and their unintended negative consequences.
I think it's very healthy. In fact, our friends at Americans for Tax Reform have a tracker of all the never needed regulations that have been waived or eliminated during this whole pandemic. And their count as of about 2 days ago was up to 670 rules. That's at the federal level and the state and local levels. And I find that very heartening. For restaurants that needed to shift over to a takeout and delivery model or else go out of business, a lot of times permits wouldn't allow that. And that saved a lot of jobs and kept a lot of families with food on the table. There were federal regulations against, say, telemedicine that were causing great harm for no good reason, due to, in part, to HIPAA regulations. Common sense prevailed to get rid of those specific parts of privacy regulations, which privacy protections are important, but telemedicine presents few obstacles to any privacy issues. So those kinds of developments are very, very heartening to see, and we're hoping for more of them. And that's one thing that we're doing at CEI, and that I was just looking at John Locke's game plan for a rebound, and that has some fantastic ideas.
Well, we thank you for that. Ryan Young is Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And you mentioned that tracker that Americans for Tax Reform is doing, more than 600 different rules. As someone who works with rules and regulations, did that surprise you, or did you say to yourself, once people started digging into these, they were going to find hundreds of different rules and regulations that probably were never needed?
Once they got started, the starting was the surprise part, because usually, as with the coronavirus stimulus bills, government uses crisis to get more power for itself. And then once it passes, it gives back some of those powers, but not all of them. So like a ratchet effect, it ratchets up and up and up permanently, never goes all the way back down. We're going to see some of that from this crisis, but when it comes to regulation, when you dig into some of the never needed rules, people are finding that, holy cow, there are a lot of them. For example, CEI just came out with the new 10,000 Commandments annual report, which gives big picture views of the regulatory state, same as the government has a spending budget where they say, this is how much money we spend, this is what we're spending it on. They don't do that for regulation, so until they do, we do. And in that, we find that the Code of Federal Regulations, which is where all these federal rules are stored, pardon the interruption, that Code of Federal Regulations exceeds 185,000 pages. That's a bit much. And of course, state and local authorities have their own regulatory codes. And as people are digging through these to look for rules that are getting in the way of the pandemic response, as well as the tough recovery ahead, we're finding 670 and counting regulations that were never needed at all. But I think we need to go one step further to make these reforms last, because we need to remain resilient against not just a potential second wave, if that happens, but also against future crises, future pandemics. And for that, we need to look not just at getting rid of this or that rule that's causing harm, but we need to look at the system that produces them year after year and produces that 185,000 page buildup. That took decades to create, and the way the system is going with 3,000 new rules at the federal level every year, that's about a new regulation every 2.5 hours. That's 7 days a week, 24/7. Something needs to be done to check the flow of those new regulations as well as the large existing stock. So we're looking at system level reforms like automatic sunsets for new regulations, an independent commission to comb through a big swath of that 185,000 pages every year, send a repeal package to Congress for an up or down vote. That thing was tried with military bases after the Cold War that needed to be closed down. That was called the Base Realignment and Closure, or BRAC commissions. Those ended up saving billions of dollars. Let's do that for regulations as well. That'll help with the virus response right now and the economic recovery right now, as well as keeping the economy more resilient for the next crisis, whenever that comes.
People like you who focus much of their attention on the world of regulations and their potential negative unintended consequences, you've seen this problem for a long time. Are you heartened that more just average, everyday folks who don't pay a whole lot of attention to what the government's doing, that they are starting to see that these rules and regulations are never needed? Is that helping the cause?
I think so. I'm not optimistic about tax and budget. Fortunately for me, my job focuses almost exclusively on the regulatory side of things. And within that narrow corridor, I am very optimistic because we're not just seeing support from one party or the other, we're seeing it from both parties, and we're seeing it at the grassroots level as well as at the policymaker level. So as long as we keep pressing that, it's not just the rules, it's the system that needs reform. We can not get rid of not just the never needed rules that are harming right now, but also the system level reforms that'll ensure that we don't get this buildup of regulatory sludge that's going to harm the recovery as well as future responses.
Have you talked to people about some of these rules and regulations? And if so, have they said, wait a minute, that was a rule? That was something that actually was in effect?
Yeah, you'd be surprised. And we've been hearing from people, not just at the federal level, but in states across the country of different political compositions. And you were speaking about the never needed hashtag. Well, we've had people in London and in Germany and in other countries also chime in with their own ideas, with their own ridiculous rules in their countries, as well as system level ideas for reform. This is turning into something of a global movement, and I am delighted to see it happen. John Locke is kicking butt with their game plan for a rebound. We're doing what we can on the federal level at CEI, and we're not alone. It's very heartening to see.
Ryan Young is Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and we're talking about this issue of regulations and the hashtag never needed movement. You talked about something, I want to get back to this because this is very important. It's not enough just to get rid of or temporarily displace the rules that are never needed, but also to look at the system that produced them. How tough is that going to be?
Extremely difficult. There's some things, I focus mainly on the federal level. Every state has its own separation of powers dynamics. Some states have a very powerful executive, others are more dominated by the legislature. At the federal level, which is mostly where I work, there's a surprising amount you can do via executive order. One thing the president did is, in an executive order he put out about a month ago, he encouraged agencies to use whatever emergency powers they have to get rid of new rules. For example, in normal times, if an agency wants to get rid of a rule, it has to make a new rule saying we want to get rid of this old rule. Then it has to publish a proposed notice in the Federal Register. That opens a 30 to 90 day public comment period, after which the agency has to take that into account and then publish a final rule, and then that'll have an effective date of who knows how long. The process takes a minimum of months and can often take years. We don't have that right now, not with COVID. So what the president did was telling agencies, just as you guys are using your emergency powers to grab power, use those same powers to cede powers where your powers are causing harm. What we're doing next is we're trying to encourage agencies as well as state legislatures and state level governors to make those waived regulations permanent. And in fact, I just saw in the news today that Idaho's governor has already done that. They've waived, I don't know how many regulations. Those waivers are now permanent. I would love to see other states copy that, and I would love to see federal agencies copy that. We're talking potentially billions of dollars in savings here. And that's a lot of livelihoods at a time when we're talking the unemployment rate is north of 13%, which fortunately is down from 14.4 or 14.7, I forget. That's depression level stuff. And we cannot sustain that. The shutdown was necessary, but it was costly, and there may well be another wave. So we have to get rid of unnecessary burdens to not just keep people safe, but also to keep them employed, to keep kids in school, keep their educational options open, to maintain access to health care. Just so many facets of life that are touched by regulation that perhaps could use with a lighter touch. So we're hoping on a lot of fronts that we can have some genuine policy successes.
Yeah, you just alluded to this, but the idea of getting rid of these unneeded and unnecessary regulations is not just in the field of healthcare and barriers to getting new treatments or new drugs, but also regulations that are going to stop the people who are unemployed now from being able to get their livelihoods back in shape, either by starting a new business, trying to start a new occupation. There are a lot of things that would be standing in their way because of regulations either at the federal or state and local level.
That's right. At the federal level, the average big business spends about $7,000 a year per employee to comply with federal rules, state and local or extra. That's $7,000 versus more than $9,000 for smaller businesses under 500 employees. That's a built-in extra $2,000 per employee barrier against small businesses. That's not fair, and we should do things to lessen that, and we should make sure that those reforms remain permanent and don't build back up. That can do as much as anything to help not just reduce the employment numbers going down, but to keep them that way.
At this point, with the pandemic really still in full swing and people being interested in knocking away some of these barriers, my guess is the people calling for status quo or keeping the current regulatory system are not going to get as much of a hearing as they typically would. But as time goes on and people feel less and less of a threat of COVID-19, do you worry at all about the regulators, the people who are part of the framework coming back and saying, well, we understand where you're coming from, but there are important reasons for us to do things the way that we've done them over and over for years?
I do, for two reasons. The first is simple status quo bias. The strongest force in all of politics isn't principle, it isn't party, it's inertia. We've always done things this way, so let's keep doing it this way. It seems to work well enough. The second reason is more nitty-gritty. It's the old problem of concentrated benefits and diffused costs. Some of the most destructive regulations to jobs at the state and local levels are occupational licensing. I'm not too familiar with North Carolina's specific regime, but I know other states require hundreds of hours of training, equivalent in some cases to almost a year's worth of full-time work to become a cosmetologist or to arrange furniture, become a decorator.
Yeah, we have one of the more stringent licensing regimes.
Then this will apply especially to you guys. Even those most absurd licensing regulations have their defenders, and those defenders are the incumbent businesses, because those rules let them keep competition out. So those licenses benefit the incumbents to the tune of potentially thousands or even millions of dollars each. That is a much bigger impact than the extra dollar or two each customer might pay for a haircut or for some other service. The benefits are very concentrated, so the incumbent interests have a very strong incentive to defend the status quo, whereas those of us, the consumers, okay, fine, so I pay a little extra. It's a bear, but I'll deal with it. That dynamic is going to be very important as far as reducing occupational licensing and a lot of other barrier to entry regulations. California might have similar problems with its AB 5 law, which is essentially the anti-gig worker law. That's going to really hurt startups and smaller businesses more than the big businesses which can afford them. So that's the other. So between status quo bias, inertia, and the more pecuniary problems like concentrated benefits and diffused costs, those are going to be two of the biggest obstacles to reform.
If people want to learn more about this, one thing they could do is go to social media and type in the hashtag never needed and see the commentary about this. But if people would like to learn more about this topic, I'm guessing that there's a way they can find out more about this from the Competitive Enterprise Institute.
That's right. Our website is CEI.org, and we have a special site for our Never Needed project, which is neverneeded.cei.org. We try to keep it simple, but we have lots of resources there, ranging from not just social media, but to op-eds and blog posts to longer policy papers. We're coming out with about 2 a week on areas ranging from trade to technology policy, as many areas as we can cover, with not just ideas for specific rules, but again, with the institution level systematic reforms that we believe are so important.